Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who like their mysteries like they like their coping mechanisms. Highly addictive. Each month we spin the wheel and land on a new genre. This time it's historical fiction. And this time, Abir Mukherjee's A Rising Man. I'm Zach, and this week I am really interested in just thinking through what this book is doing as historical fiction, how is it set, and how this plot can be understood as a vehicle for understanding the past.
I'm Bob, and I agree completely, Zach. I want to talk about this book. I think we have different opinions about it. We're going to find out soon, but I think this is so interesting as far as a historical fiction piece, and I think it might be our historical fiction piece this time that most engages deliberately with history and is trying to tease something out in history. So I think it's a very important book as far as trying to tell something about history.
That's a really good point, and I think I agree with you that it is the one that seems most interested in engaging with or teaching us about history. But how do you think it does that? Like, what is it doing that is so different than the other books we've read?
So similar to Power and the Glory, it's set. This one is set in 1919, so almost around the same time as last time's book. This one, Abir Mukherjee, is really interesting. He wants to look at his own educational past. I thought this was great. Growing up in Scotland and then learning about different parts of the world and then never really learning about India and then thinking, wait a minute, why are we suddenly learning things that contradict what we learned in grade school when he's getting into high school, getting later into college, and then thinking his one of his main questions was whether we can learn anything from history. And I thought that was such a fascinating way to write a book. I will take this subject and I am going to figure out, okay, how do people actually treat each other? What was actually going on? And then what does that mean for us today?
And he does this in it's a really pleasing setup, I guess I should say. We have our detective, San Wyndham, who is freshly arrived in Calcutta. Today we call it Kolkata. In the book, it's Calcutta. I'm gonna stop twisting myself in circles and just stick to one. So he just arrives in Calcutta. So we as the readers follow this new character who has just arrived and become introduced to this new world at the same speed in which our protagonist is. It's a really nice vehicle for us as readers to learn about this time in India.
Yeah, it's like a stranger in a strange land, or a stranger comes to town and he's our eyes on the ground. Sam Wyndham is a really interesting character. He works for Scotland Yard. He's coming to India and going to work with Digby, who also, he's British, I think. And they are going to work together to solve a murder. Now, this murder seems like it could be politically motivated, and that is why this book, I think, gets so interesting. Again, his three main questions for writing this were, what is the relationship between British and Indians really like? He wants to find out and uses Wyndham to find that out. He also wants to know, how does a moral Christian people justify to itself the oppression of another race? And then he also asks, how did the British and the Indians manage a nonviolent freedom struggle, which was very unique at the time and just in general. I think Wyndham is a perfect person to do this, especially when the author is so familiar with Scottish people. He's a Scottish person himself, and he's saying, okay, we're going to go learn step by step. And as readers, we get to learn a lot of history as Wyndham does. And it's not just throwing history at us, it's engaging with it and learning the significance of it for answering those three questions.
I also, I really like that first point you made about how the author is kind of doing his own investigating and using an investigator in order to actually do that in the fictional world. And I guess what I mean by that is the investigator is really unique in the society in which the investigator can talk to anyone at any time. They can travel to the highest seats of government power, or they could interview, as in the case in this book, the prostitutes at the local brothel. So all sections of society are open to the curious eyes of the investigator in the book. And this kind of panoscopic vision really allows the author to look at all of the ways in which the different levels of society interlink with each other.
And I love that because it completely participates in all of the hard-boiled that we've read before, detective stories that we've read before. Take, for example, Dashiell Hammett. We have Sam Spade talking to the lowest of the low and then talking to the highest. Well, maybe they're not the highest of the high, but they're extremely wealthy people. And it's a tradition for these detective novels to let the inspector do that. And I love Abir Mukherjee doing that because he's read tons and tons and tons of detective novels. This is his first novel because he saw, I think it was Lee Child, didn't write something until he was 39. So Mukherjee wrote this at 39. Yep. But he's truly a detective scholar. Like, he has read everything. And you can see it working through this. We even have Wyndham's addiction to morphine and opium. And it reminds me a lot of Sherlock Holmes, our first consulting detective.
Yeah, I'm glad that you honed in on this detective angle, because for me, I don't want to say I was disappointed. That's not the right word. I read the summary of this book before reading it and said, oh, a book set in the early 1900s featuring a British detective. This surely will be, have the feeling of a cozy British, murder mystery type thing. I was so surprised that this was, as best as I could tell, a hard-boiled detective fiction novel set in India. What do you think about that?
There are some elements that are quite cozy, though. I mean, we keep coming back to the bad lunches, where he's staying, and it's kind of the same thing again and again, the same joke, but that's cozy. I think this feels a lot more like the hard-boiled detectives. However, Wyndham has everything under control, like Sherlock Holmes. He's not going in and out of consciousness like The Long Goodbye. Farewell, My Lovely. So it feels more like Wyndham is straight, follows the books. He goes by the books. He's not willing to do anything corrupt. And he is a very interesting character in this corrupt world. And that is one of the things that Mukherjee likes a lot. That's his favorite genre, I guess, of detective fiction, is a upstanding detective who has to uphold a corrupt world, who has to live in a corrupt society. So as Wyndham is finding out all of these things that are wrong, or these laws that are extremely unfair to Indians, or just even his... what would you say? I guess the people that he works with, other inspectors, other people above him, they're very corrupt in ways while still following the law. And I think that's very interesting to follow this genre. So while it's longer than a Dashiell Hammett, I think we still have a similar pattern. Someone like Philip Marlowe for Raymond Chandler, who wants to do the right thing, but keeps finding that there is no way to do the right thing.
It's interesting you brought up Raymond Chandler earlier, because I think that, the length and the development of this book, it really helps to contrast that with Chandler. So the previous Chandler book we read, Farewell, My Lovely, involved the character going from one place, kind of solving a problem, to another place, solving a problem. It was like a constellation of different issues. And it makes sense because the novel was written as a fix-up novel. He took 4 different short stories, whatever, and just smash them into a novel. Just imagine taking 3 separate balls of dough and just kind of pushing them together until you have a big ball of dough. This novel does something really interesting. I thought we were in fix-up territory, because the detectives are going from one case involving the murdered official to something, a train robbery, et cetera, et cetera. But it actually takes a different route in this by tying everything together into a larger grand narrative. And in that way, it really reminded me of like the modern thriller novel more than anything. Like reading like Tom Clancy, where it's like, oh, you start out with this little thing that the character's investigating, and suddenly it's revealed that this little thing is symptomatic of the world ending. We have to stop a nationalist insurrection so that India doesn't just, completely become overthrown, while also dealing with corruption at the top levels of government. It's from a small thing to just everything is at stake now.
Kind of like the Raymond Chandler novel that you just said, where he's doing a fix-up. It's almost like these officials are trying to do a fix-up. They're putting all of these things together to frame Sen, so they can finally put him behind bars, and he can no longer, get people thinking about revolution. He has changed now to a nonviolent revolution, but that is when it gets most exciting. This threat to the balance between India and Britain, Britain occupying India and the Raj system at this point. And everyone that Wyndham is working for and the people that have brought him in there, even Bigby, they're trying to pull the wool over his eyes and get him to put all of the evidence on Sen. And eventually when he figures out it is kind of a frame up or a con, not a long con, but they're trying to frame him, he tells his superior that, and he says, yes, I know. But you should do the smart thing. And what is the smart thing? So he can get promoted, putting Sen behind bars, and then everything is all cozy. So it's strange to have to root for the downfall of our main character's whole operation.
It's hard when we're dealing with historical fiction because, it's not clear to me that we're rooting for the downfall of the character's operation because we know, in a sense, that there's an inevitability that the Raj is going to end. So it's like watching a prequel film where, because how the larger narrative ends, some of the tension becomes a little bit deflated, I guess I would say. It's, even if they don't get their way this time, it's simply a matter of time,
But here's where I think it's what Mukherjee is doing, why it's so interesting is, yes, we already know what happens. We know that the Raj falls, because of nonviolent protest, they end the Raj. But for our character, if we're going to identify with him, we have to decide, okay, are we going to root for him or are we not going to root for him? Are we going to find that he has made the correct ideological choice, at least for our eyes? Has he done the right thing or the wrong thing? And I think when we see that, him working with Banerjee, we see it a lot while the two of them are trying to do the honest thing and prove that Sen is not guilty. We see a lot of how British people started to treat Indians in India at this time. And I think that is, again, why Mukherjee is writing such an interesting book here, where he says the British came over, or at least they told themselves they were trying to do the right thing. They were trying to help. And he says that about the whole establishment and even about Wyndham. Except what they notice is when they're around Indians, they start to develop this moral superiority. And they talk about this moral superiority, believing that they are better than anyone else around them. And we have to think, okay, is Wyndham going to learn to trust Banerjee, who is he's right all the time, whereas Bigby is wrong all the time? Is he really going to learn to trust Banerjee and do the right thing? Or is he going to fold and continue to serve these people who are just trying to keep power in place?
So this kind of brings me back to a note I jotted down while I was reading it, which is, even though Sam Wyndham is, I guess we could say, the protagonist, the person who the narrator feels most closely tied to, I was thinking as I was reading this that it's interesting how Sam Wyndham doesn't necessarily have character growth in the way that you would expect a true protagonist to have. Yes, by the end of it, he goes from maybe a little bit more idealistic to slightly recognizing perhaps his place, becoming more cynical. He has that conversation at the end where it's kind of, I guess I would say, revealed to him by a superior that his role is to maintain the power system, not to upend it. But the character which has had the most character growth by far is Surendranath Banerjee, the Watson to his Sherlock, so to speak, which Banerjee goes on this journey from being someone who keeps his eyes cast down low, who seems to be very, very implicitly aware of the power dynamics and what is proper and improper, and oftentimes won't enter spaces. Will just say, "Oh no, I'll wait outside," to coming to a point where he realizes a kind of political consciousness and his own role in upending the Raj. He tells his family he's going to quit, and then when Wyndham finally convinces him to stay, he ends up being kicked out by his family. So there's this moment of true, I guess you would say, individuation. He's made a choice for himself. He has turned into much more of an independent individual, and he's standing by his ideals of what he thinks the right thing to do is. against his family, against his upbringing, slightly against his culture even, but for a greater good. I guess my point being is that the minor character is the person who seems to get the true actualization here, or at least becomes much further along in that process than our supposed protagonist.
And he's so, I want to read more of these books because I like Banerjee so much. Wyndham is a strong, solid character to follow, but Banerjee is making such interesting inferences as a detective as they go along. The body that they find has paper shoved in its mouth, and there's a message on it that's I think it's in Hindi, could be in Bengali, but they wrote it in a way that Banerjee recognizes is extremely formal. He says it's like using thou and thine, but no one else seems to recognize why on earth would Sen write in very formal, almost like King's English version to get the attention of English people. Why wouldn't he just write English when he is a perfectly good English speaker? And so he figures out that some of the English are trying to frame Sen. Banerjee is constantly doing interesting things like that. He has so much insight. And I think you're right. He has this growth of, he wanted to join the police force so he could, when India decides to kick out all of these British and become their own independent country again, he will be one of the people who knows how to carry things on and keep things orderly. And then by the end, it's a weird buddy cop relationship between he and Wyndham. And he and Wyndham have been polite to each other the whole time, but they haven't exactly seen eye to eye until the very end. And I think that comes to one of Mukherjee's questions is like, what really was the relationship between British and Indians? What was it really like at this time? Obviously, Bigby, he's a bigot. You know, Bigby sucks. But Wyndham
Digby.
Did I say Bigby? Oh, yeah. Bigby the bigot. That's why. Sorry, Digby sucks. Digby sucks, but Wyndham and Banerjee get along really well, and I want to see how their relationship develops and how it continues to be. Is Banerjee going to radicalize Wyndham, or how will they continue to solve these cases together?
Yeah, in many ways, this book felt like not a trailer, a pilot episode for a TV series, in the sense that, you know, we introduce all of our characters, we see how they get along, and then at the end of it, they move in together. And, you know, when they move in together, you're just like, oh boy, here we go. Up to more hijinks next week with the boys. So for me, it felt like we were really setting ourselves up for a sequel right here.
Again, just like Sherlock Holmes, shows us again that Mukherjee is really interested in the history of detective work and detective novels.
I guess real quick, I just want to say something about his method as a detective, because I felt like the touch was so feather light. And, you know, that's something I always like to pay attention to. How do people solve their crimes? And it seems to be different. Every good detective has their own good methodology. Here, it was so... I couldn't tell what was going on here. Almost every insight this person had was like a burst of creative inspiration. You wouldn't even be thinking it over or like kind of rationally going over clues. You'd just be like, hey, wait a minute. This is the answer. What did you make of this?
Sometimes it did remind me of old Mike Hammer when he drinks too much beer, because this guy would often drink too much whiskey, lie in his bed and think about things. But it's fun. It is more like a Sherlock Holmes novel sometimes, where it feels more like an adventure, you know, because sometimes he and Banerjee are climbing up a building to find a terrorist. Sometimes they're around a bunch of stray dogs. It is kind of the spur of the moment creative inspiration. He does, though, fall for a femme fatale. So it does feel like a throwback back to the hard-boiled detectives, too.
Yeah, I will say, you know, when we started the book, and, you know, the two immediate things we know as readers of the book are like, okay, Digby sucks and Annie is perfect. And I got a little frustrated because I was like, as a reader, I need either Digby to have his redemption or Annie to be revealed as a villain. Like, one of these two things needs to happen. Even both things, you know, I'll take both. But I was like, we got to have one of these things happen, because I don't know why, but when the author takes so much pain to tell you how good or how bad a certain character is, for me, I'm like, I really need a payoff. I don't I don't want to just take you at your word. I want you to be setting this up so that it's upended in some way.
Well, you got what you wanted. I mean, he turns out to be a traitor.
There were a lot of times when Digby, I guess you could say, like, guessed right or furthered the case along, and people were saying like, "Oh, Digby might get promoted up above you," things like that. I was like, "Wow, maybe we are in for a Digby redemption arc." No, unfortunately, no.
Digby's just leading us on.
I want to think about this in terms of the historical fiction books we've read thus far. Kazuo Ishiguro's Remains of the Day and Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. One thing I noticed about this book is, much more than these two other novels, this book seems so interested in teaching us, in showing us things and being like, hey, here's how the system works.
I think with the first book, Kazuo Ishiguro, he was more interested in the trope of the butler and what did that mean for the average person's experience. How are we all a butler? Why are we a butler inside? And it was convenient to set a butler in that time, a butler who is moving away from past traditions, yet is extremely traditional. And what does that mean for him? Yeah. Then in Power and the Glory, it's this terrible thing happened. I'm going to tell you about it, but I'm also going to give you a glimpse into the power of Catholicism in a very terrible struggle. But I think Mukherjee is interesting, especially in this, because both of those other books is like, here's my main historical fiction idea, and it's just going to run on one track, as excellent as they were. This is kind of like a track that is kind of going back and forth, because sometimes it's maybe the British Empire is okay. Sometimes no, it seems to be very, very terrible, insidious in ways. And there are little questions about how much do people really know they're participating in it. I think the devotion to history is sending Mukherjee in different directions. How did you feel about it?
I don't know. It's really, really hard for me because I appreciated the insight into the time and the culture that the book was portraying, but I couldn't escape this feeling that the perspective of the story was a 2025 or, a 2020s consciousness, a 2020s perspective kind of transplanted into the body of a 1919 man. And one thing that this book made me ponder, I guess, ponder might not be the right word, but is the difference between reading a book where the protagonist is actually trying to embody the spirit of the times being portrayed versus a book which, in order to teach you, necessarily needs to have some kind of distance, some kind of narrative distance from the matter in which it's being teaching. So like in a book like The Power and the Glory, which was written very, very close to the time in which it's portraying, the things that it teaches you about that time aren't necessarily what the character tells you about. Sometimes it's just the way that it's written, the things that the author has to say, the asides, the way it references people, or just the ways in which certain interactions play out, for example. But in contrast to that, this one seems to, it doesn't show. It just simply tells. This is how it was. This is what you can take away of it. And maybe most importantly, and troublingly, I'm not sure, this is how you should think about it.
I think that would be my main issue too, is there's a lot of telling. There's a lot of teaching. It's hard to compete with Graham Greene, though. I mean, you can't really stack people up to Graham Greene. He's his own, master of writing. But I feel like this is not just shoving everything down our throats. I feel like it is a participation. There are elements that are just like characters will speak for a long time about what this history means and explain it to us. But take some of the Irish or Scottish characters, for example. We have an Irishman who is helping Sen or helping some other organization by giving them arms. So not helping Sen, but other organizations trying to get for freedom. And he has his own soapbox at one point talking about Indian independence and Irish independence. There are lots of different, not necessarily lenses because they're not really changing our perspective as the reader, but there are so many characters with their own, I guess, motivations. And while that is very important for a detective novel, I think it's extra special in this book. Even though it is clunky at times, it is a lot of telling. I think it's extra special because the motivations for the people who are the red herrings or who are the killer or who are in the crime are completely integral with history and the politics going on at the time. They're not just window dressing characters. They are the main arguments that are very necessary to think about in this book.
I guess what I want to know from you, Bob, is I think there's 3 other books in the series. How interested are you in continuing down the path of Wyndham and Banerjee?
I'm very interested. I feel very confident that he is not just going to give us another random. Sorry, this wasn't random. I mean, often a follow-up to a mystery will be a random book of, oh, here's just a mystery that these 2 guys solved. I think we will see more big questions about those 3 central questions that he wanted to ask. And what does it mean to be an empire? And what does it mean to be a country occupied by an empire? So what does it mean to be a country that's a colony? So I would definitely read the rest of these Wyndham and Banerjee mysteries.
Yeah, I'm excited too as well. I think that, and the nice thing about these is we could slot them in with our mysteries or slot them in with our historical fiction. So, I think we should make it happen. All right. Talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.